Welcome, traveller of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. But here's what's truly fascinating. These weren't just random acts of debauchery hidden in dark corners. What we're talking about is an entire organized industry that operated openly in the heart of one of Rome's most prosperous cities. An industry that reveals more about ancient Roman society, economics, and human nature than any textbook could ever teach you. In this video, I'm going to take you inside the brothels of ancient Pompeii. We'll explore how this trade actually worked, who were the people involved, and what their stories can tell us about life in the Roman Empire. But I need to warn you up front, this isn't your typical history lesson. The evidence we're dealing with is graphic, controversial, and at times deeply disturbing by modern standards. What makes this even more incredible is that we have names, faces, and personal stories of real people who lived and worked in these establishments. People like Novelia Primigenia, whose story we'll uncover later, and the mysterious woman known only as the Sorceress of Pompeii. These weren't just statistics or anonymous figures from history. They were real human beings with hopes, dreams, and struggles that got frozen in time on that fateful day in 79 AD. By the end of this series, you'll understand not just what happened in these places, but why they existed, how they shaped Roman culture, and what their sudden preservation can teach us about one of history's most fascinating civilizations. And trust me, some of these revelations will completely change how you think about the ancient world. But before we step into the shadowy streets of ancient Pompeii's red light district, let me paint you a picture of what this city was really like in its final days. Picture this. It's a sweltering afternoon in August 79 AD. The streets of Pompeii buzz with activity as merchants hawk their wares. Slaves hurry past carrying amphorae of wine and olive oil, and wealthy Romans in their pristine togas discuss business deals in the shade of marble columns. The air is thick with the smell of bread baking, fish sauce fermenting, and the constant underlying scent of sulfur from the mountain that looms over everything. This isn't the quiet museum piece we know today. This is a living, breathing commercial hub with over 15,000 residents. Money flows through these streets like water. Pompeii sits at the intersection of major trade routes, its port bustling with ships from across the Mediterranean. Fortunes are made and lost daily, and with that wealth comes every vice and pleasure that money can buy. Now, here's where most history books get squeamish, but we're not going to shy away from the truth. Sex was big business in Pompeii, and it wasn't hidden away in shame. It was advertised, regulated, and integrated into daily life in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Walk down any major street in Pompeii, and you'd encounter something that would stop you in your tracks. Carved into stone sidewalks, etched into building walls, painted on shop fronts, you'd see explicit images that leave absolutely nothing to the imagination. These weren't crude graffiti made by rebellious teenagers. These were professional advertisements, directional signs, and artistic decorations commissioned by business owners and approved by city officials. The Romans had a completely different relationship with sexuality than we do today. What we consider private and taboo, they treated as natural and commercial. But this wasn't some free love paradise. This was a highly stratified society with strict rules about who could do what, where, and with whom. Let me introduce you to Marcus Crassus Frugi, a wealthy merchant who owned property throughout Pompeii's entertainment district. Marcus wasn't some sleazy underworld figure hiding in the shadows. He was a respectable businessman, a member of the local elite, who saw the sex trade as just another investment opportunity. His properties included taverns, small hotels, and yes, establishments that catered to more intimate needs. Marcus represents something crucial about Roman society that modern people often misunderstand. The Romans didn't see a moral contradiction between public respectability and profiting from vice. In fact, wealthy Romans regularly invested in gladiator schools, taverns, and brothels while maintaining their status as pillars of the community. But here's where it gets really interesting. The people working in these establishments weren't all the same. Roman society was incredibly complex, with rigid hierarchies that determined everything about a person's life, including their sexual autonomy. At the top were the wealthy courtesans, women like Faustilla, whose beauty and wit could command prices that ordinary citizens couldn't afford. Faustilla wasn't technically a prostitute in the way we might understand the term. She was more like a high-class companion, educated, refined, and selective about her clients. She could read and write, spoke multiple languages, and entertained senators and wealthy merchants in luxurious surroundings. Faustilla's house, discovered in Pompeii's more affluent quarter, tells a story of surprising independence. The frescoes on her walls depict not just erotic scenes, but also images of female empowerment, goddesses, and symbols of protection. This wasn't the dwelling of a victim, but of a woman who had found a way to thrive within the constraints of her society. But Faustilla's story is just one layer of a much more complex reality. Women like Iris, a freed slave who operate, descend the social ladder, and you encountered what we might call a mid-tier establishment. Iris had purchased her freedom, probably using money earned through sex work, and now ran her own business. She employed other women, managed her own finances, and even owned property. Her story challenges our assumptions about powerlessness and exploitation in the ancient world. Iris's establishment, located near the Forum, catered to merchants, travelers, and middle-class Romans. The building itself reveals fascinating details about how these businesses operated. Multiple small rooms, each decorated with different erotic scenes, surrounded a central courtyard where clients could drink wine, eat food, and socialize before making their selection. But perhaps most intriguing are the inscriptions found scratched into the walls of Iris's establishment. These aren't just crude drawings or boastful claims. They're personal messages, some heartbreakingly intimate. One reads in Latin, "I was here with Glycera, and she made me forget my troubles." Another says, "Restituta, you have such a wicked tongue." These glimpses into private moments humanize experiences that historical records usually reduce to statistics. Yet the story becomes much darker as we continue down the social hierarchy. At the bottom were the slaves, women, and men who had no choice in their circumstances, no control over their bodies, and no hope of escape except through the unlikely possibility of earning enough to purchase their freedom. These individuals worked in the most basic establishments, the true brothels that modern excavations have revealed in shocking detail. The most famous of these is the Lupanar, a two-story building that has become synonymous with Pompeii's sex trade. But calling it famous almost seems wrong, given the human tragedy it represents. This wasn't glamorous or romantic. This was industrial-scale exploitation housed in a building so small and cramped that it's difficult to imagine human beings living and working there. The lupanar contained 10 tiny rooms, each barely large enough for a narrow bed. The walls were decorated with explicit frescoes, but these weren't artistic expressions of sexuality. They were essentially menus, advertising services available within. Above each room was a small window, and archaeologists have found evidence that names were posted there, presumably identifying which worker was available in each space. What makes the lupanar even more haunting is the graffiti left by clients. Over 120 inscriptions have been found, ranging from crude boasts to surprisingly tender expressions of affection. One client wrote, "Myrtis, you suck well. Another left the message, "I screwed many girls here," but others reveal glimpses of genuine human connection. "I love Chie," and "Successus was here with Petronia." These weren't just commercial transactions. They were human interactions, however constrained by the brutal realities of slavery and exploitation. But here's what's truly remarkable about the archaeological evidence from Pompeii. We can actually trace the lives of specific individuals who worked in these establishments. We know their names, can see the spaces where they lived and worked, and in some cases, can follow their stories across multiple locations and time periods. Take the case of Prima, whose name appears in multiple locations throughout the city. Prima seems to have worked her way up from the most basic establishments to more comfortable circumstances, possibly purchasing her freedom and eventually operating her own business. Her story, pieced together from inscriptions, property records, and archaeological evidence, represents one of the few success stories we can document, or consider the mysterious figure known only as the Syrian woman, whose exotic origin was apparently part of her appeal to Roman clients. References to her appear throughout the city, suggesting she developed a significant reputation and possibly accumulated considerable wealth. The Syrian woman represents the international nature of Pompeii's sex trade, which drew workers from across the Mediterranean world. These personal stories matter because they remind us that we're not just studying an abstract historical phenomenon. We're examining the lives of real people who navigated complex social and economic systems, made difficult choices, and found ways to survive and sometimes thrive in circumstances that were often beyond their control. But understanding these individual stories requires understanding the larger system they were part of. Roman attitudes towards sexuality were shaped by concepts of power, status, and social hierarchy that are fundamentally different from modern Western values. In Roman society, sexual activity wasn't primarily about love, pleasure, or personal fulfillment. It was about power and social positioning. Who you could have sex with, how, and under what circumstances were all determined by your place in the social hierarchy. Freeborn Roman citizens had rights and protections that slaves and foreigners didn't possess. Men had privileges that women couldn't access. The wealthy had options that the poor could never afford. This creates a complex moral landscape that doesn't fit neatly into modern categories of right and wrong, consensual and exploitative, empowered and victimized. Some women in Pompeii's sex trade clearly operated with considerable independence and accumulated significant wealth. Others were trapped in circumstances of brutal exploitation with no possibility of escape. Understanding this moral complexity becomes even more crucial when we examine the legal framework that governed Pompeii's sex trade. Roman law didn't prohibit prostitution, but it did create elaborate regulations that reveal the contradictions at the heart of Roman society. The legal code distinguished between different types of sexual commerce based on the social status of the participants. A freeborn Roman woman who engaged in prostitution would lose her citizenship rights and be classified as infames, legally infamous. She couldn't marry a Roman citizen, couldn't inherit property in the normal way, and couldn't testify in court. But a slave woman engaging in the same activities was simply fulfilling the economic function assigned to her by her owner. This legal distinction created a strange paradox. Women like Claudia Fortunata, whose tombstone was discovered in Pompeii's necropolis, navigated these regulations with remarkable skill. Claudia had been born free, but family financial troubles forced her into sex work. Rather than accepting the legal consequences, she found a way to maintain her citizenship by technically operating as a tavern keeper rather than a prostitute. Claudia's tavern, located on one of Pompeii's busiest streets, served food and wine during the day and offered more intimate services after dark. The legal fiction allowed her to avoid the most severe penalties while still operating in the sex trade. Her tombstone, erected by grateful former employees, describes her as a beloved patron who helped other women navigate similar circumstances. But Claudia's story also reveals the constant threat that hung over women in her position. City records show that she was arrested multiple times for violating regulations about when and where certain activities could take place. Each arrest meant fines, and accumulated violations could result in exile or worse. The stress of constant legal jeopardy took its toll, and Claudia died young, probably in her early 30s. The regulations extended beyond individual workers to the physical spaces where the trade operated. Roman law required that certain activities be conducted in designated areas, away from temples, schools, and respectable residential neighborhoods. This created distinct red light districts, and Pompeii had several. The largest was located near the harbor, where sailors and merchants created steady demand for entertainment. This district included not just brothels, but also taverns, gambling houses, and small hotels. The buildings were constructed with specific features mandated by law: separate entrances for different types of businesses, soundproofing between rooms, and windows positioned to provide privacy from the street. Walking through this district would have been an assault on the senses. The narrow streets were packed with people at all hours. Music spilled from taverns, the smell of cooking food mixed with perfumes and incense, and vendors hawked everything from wine to exotic delicacies imported from across the empire. In the middle of this chaos stood the establishment run by Asalina, probably the most successful businesswoman in Pompeii's entertainment industry. Asalina owned multiple properties, employed dozens of workers, and had business relationships with some of the city's wealthiest families. Her main establishment was a combination tavern, hotel, and brothel that could accommodate over 100 clients simultaneously. What made Asalina extraordinary wasn't just her business success, but her political involvement. Graffiti found throughout Pompeii shows that she actively campaigned for local political candidates, using her influence and resources to support politicians who favored policies beneficial to her industry. One inscription reads, "Asalina and her girls support Marcus Cyrenius for a dial." Asalina's political activities weren't unusual. The sex trade was so economically important to Pompeii that politicians couldn't afford to ignore it. Tax revenues from these businesses helped fund public works projects, religious festivals, and municipal services. The trade also provided employment, directly and indirectly, for hundreds of people. But Asalina's story takes a dark turn when we examine the working conditions in her establishment. Archaeological evidence suggests that while she lived in luxury, many of her employees endured harsh circumstances. The rooms where workers lived were tiny, poorly ventilated, and showed signs of constant overcrowding. Medical evidence from skeletal remains indicates high rates of disease, malnutrition, and physical trauma. This contrast between Asalina's success and her workers' suffering illustrates one of the most troubling aspects of Pompeii's sex trade. The system created opportunities for some to accumulate wealth and power, but only by exploiting others who had no alternatives. The exploitation becomes even more apparent when we examine the ages of the workers. Roman law permitted the sexual use of slaves from age 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Skeletal analysis of remains found in Pompeii's brothels suggests that many workers began their careers as children and rarely lived past 30. Consider the case of Fortunata, whose skeleton was found in a small room behind one of the city's taverns. Bone analysis indicates she was approximately 13 when she died, probably from complications related to pregnancy. Scratched into the wall beside her bed was a single word: Mama. This heartbreaking discovery reminds us that behind the economic statistics and legal regulations were real children, torn from their families and forced into circumstances no human being should endure. Yet even within this system of exploitation, we find evidence of resistance, adaptation, and occasionally triumph. The graffiti in Pompeii's brothels includes messages that suggest workers found ways to maintain dignity and human connection despite their circumstances. One inscription found in the Lupanar reads, "Sabina, you suck well, but you charge too much." Below it, in different handwriting, someone added, "Sabina says, you get what you pay for." This exchange suggests that some workers maintained enough agency to negotiate prices and defend their professional reputation. Another fascinating example comes from a small establishment near the amphitheatre, where archaeologists found a room decorated entirely by one of the workers. The frescoes depict not erotic scenes, but images of freedom. Birds in flight, open doors, distant mountains. The artist, whose name we'll never know, created a private world of hope and imagination within the confines of her physical imprisonment. These small acts of resistance and self-expression become even more poignant when we consider the broader social context. Roman society was built on the assumption that some people existed primarily to serve the pleasure and convenience of others. Slaves, foreigners, and the poor were considered fundamentally different from freeborn Roman citizens, with fewer rights to bodily autonomy, personal dignity, and self-determination. This social hierarchy wasn't just theoretical. It was enforced through law, custom, and violence. Workers in Pompeii's sex trade who tried to leave their positions illegally could be hunted down and severely punished. Those who became pregnant were expected to continue working until the very end, and their children automatically became slaves unless special arrangements were made. But the hierarchy also created unexpected opportunities. Some workers used their intimate access to wealthy and powerful clients to gather information, build networks, and accumulate resources that could eventually purchase freedom or protection. Marcus Epidius Sabinus, a wealthy wool merchant, maintained a long-term relationship with a woman named Taish, who worked in one of the harbour district establishments. Their relationship, documented in love letters found in Marcus's house, evolved from commercial to personal over several years. Marcus eventually purchased Taish's freedom, married her in a private ceremony that wasn't legally recognised but was socially accepted, and included her in his business operations. Taish's story represents one of the few documented cases of someone completely escaping the sex trade through a personal relationship. But her letters reveal the psychological complexity of her situation. Even after gaining her freedom, she struggled with feelings of shame and uncertainty about her place in respectable society. Her relationship with Marcus was genuine, but it was also built on the foundation of their original commercial transaction. The economic relationships were equally complex. Pompeii's sex trade operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the street level, individual transactions involved small amounts of money, often just enough to buy a meal or a cup of wine. But at the ownership level, successful establishments generated enormous profits that were invested in real estate, shipping, manufacturing, and other legitimate businesses. This economic integration meant that Pompeii's sex trade wasn't separate from the mainstream economy, but was woven throughout it. The leather goods sold in the forum were often manufactured by workers who also provided sexual services. The wine served at respectable dinner parties was produced on estates that used profits from brothels to fund expansion. The beautiful frescoes that decorated wealthy homes were painted by artists who also created erotic advertisements for less respectable establishments. This interconnected economy created a web of complicity that extended far beyond the obvious participants. Senators who publicly condemned vice privately collected rent from properties in the red light district. Priests who preached about moral purity invested temple funds in businesses that generated profits from prostitution. Even the city's most respectable matrons wore jewelry and silk clothing purchased with money that could be traced back to the brothels. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Graffiti found near the forum includes satirical comments about prominent citizens and their business interests. One inscription mockingly refers to Gaius Cuspius Pansa, a wealthy politician, as the senator who profits from sin while preaching virtue. Another suggests that Marcus Holconius Rufus, who funded the construction of a theatre, used money earned from entertaining the masses in more ways than one. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Pompeii's sex trade was how it reflected broader Roman attitudes about power, pleasure, and human value. The Romans didn't see sexuality as inherently shameful, but they did believe that sexual roles should reflect social hierarchies. A free Roman citizen was expected to be dominant, never submissive. A wealthy person could purchase sexual services, but providing them was degrading. A man could visit brothels without losing respectability, but a woman engaging in the same behavior faced social exile. These attitudes created bizarre contradictions that played out daily in Pompeii's streets. Consider the case of Lucius Caesius, a young aristocrat from a prominent family who became infatuated with a male slave named Ganymedes, who worked in one of the city's more exclusive establishments. Lucius visited regularly, spent enormous sums, and even wrote love poetry that was later found carved into the walls of Ganymedes' room. But when Lucius's father discovered the relationship, the scandal wasn't about the homosexual aspect, which was socially acceptable for a Roman man, as long as he remained the dominant partner. The problem was that Lucius had fallen in love, had allowed himself to become emotionally vulnerable to someone of inferior social status. This violated fundamental Roman principles about how power should flow in sexual relationships. The father's solution reveals the cold calculation that governs such matters. Rather than simply forbidding the relationship, he purchased Ganymedes, freed him, and then arranged for him to disappear from the city. Lucius was married off to a respectable young woman within a month. The emotional devastation this caused both young men was considered irrelevant compared to maintaining proper social order. Ganymedes' fate remains a mystery, but similar stories throughout Pompeii suggest that such disappearances weren't uncommon. The sex trade created intense personal connections that threatened established hierarchies, and those connections were ruthlessly severed when they became inconvenient for powerful constraints. Some individuals manage people, yet within these to carve out spaces of genuine agency and connection. The establishment run by a woman known as Zmirina, the Egyptian, provides a fascinating example of how foreign origin could sometimes be transformed into commercial advantage. Zmirina had been brought to Pompeii as a slave, probably captured during one of Rome's military campaigns in the eastern Mediterranean. But instead of being assigned to agricultural labor or domestic service, she was placed in a brothel because her exotic appearance and mysterious cultural background appealed to Roman fantasies about foreign women. Over time, Zmirina learned to manipulate these fantasies for her own benefit. She cultivated an image as a sorceress and fortune teller, claiming to possess ancient Egyptian wisdom about love, sexuality, and the future. Clients came not just for sexual services, but for magical potions, prophecies, and exotic rituals that Zmirina invented based on half-remembered fragments of her childhood culture. The performance was so successful that Zmirina eventually saved enough money to purchase her freedom and establish her own business. Her house, discovered in a residential area rather than the traditional red light district, was decorated with authentic Egyptian artifacts mixed with Roman erotic art. The combination created an atmosphere of mysterious sensuality that attracted wealthy clients willing to pay premium prices for unique experiences. But Zmirina's story also illustrates the psychological costs of such success. Letters found in her house, written in a mixture of Latin and Greek, reveal deep loneliness and cultural displacement. She had achieved financial independence and social respectability of a sort, but at the cost of commodifying her own cultural identity and maintaining a persona that grew increasingly distant from her authentic self. The pressure of constant performance took its toll on many sex workers, regardless of their level of success. Archaeological evidence suggests high rates of mental distress, self-medication with alcohol and drugs, and early death from what modern medicine would recognize as stress-related illnesses. The remains of Julia Felix, found in what appears to have been a suicide, illustrate this tragic pattern. Julia had been one of Pompeii's most successful courtesans, with wealthy clients throughout the region and property investments that made her genuinely wealthy. But her private writings, preserved by volcanic ash, reveal crushing anxiety about aging, losing her looks, and being discarded by clients who could always find younger alternatives. Julia's final letter, addressed to a sister living in Rome, describes the unbearable pressure of maintaining her appearance and performance while watching younger competitors arrive daily from across the empire. She writes, "I am 31 years old, which might as well be 60 in this business. Every morning, I look in the mirror and see new lines, new signs that my value is diminishing. How long before they stop coming? How long before I am forgotten?" The letter was never sent. Julia's body was found beside it, along with an empty vial that had contained a poison common in antiquity. Her death represents the dark side of what appeared to be success within the system. Yet not all stories ended in tragedy. Some workers found ways to transition out of the sex trade and into different roles within Roman society. The case of Drusilla, a former slave who became a successful tavern owner, shows how entrepreneurial skill and careful networking could create genuine opportunities for social mobility. Drusilla had worked in several of Pompeii's establishments before saving enough money to rent a small tavern near the city's main gate. Rather than trying to compete with established businesses, she created a niche serving travelers who needed lodging, meals, and information about the city. Her background in the sex trade actually proved advantageous because she understood the entertainment industry and could direct visitors to appropriate establishments while maintaining her own respectability. Over time, Drusilla's tavern became an unofficial information center where merchants, travelers, and local residents came to exchange news, conduct business, and socialize. She reinvested her profits in the business, expanding the building and hiring employees who were themselves trying to transition out of sex work. Drusilla's success wasn't just personal. She created a model that other women followed, establishing a network of businesses that provided alternatives to direct participation in prostitution while still serving the broader entertainment economy. These businesses operated in the grey area between respectability and vice, offering services that respectable establishments couldn't provide while maintaining enough legitimacy to avoid constant legal harassment. The network included women like Secunda, who operated a small hotel that catered to couples seeking privacy for extramarital affairs, and Tertia, who ran a shop selling cosmetics, perfumes, and aphrodisiacs imported from across the Mediterranean. These businesses required insider knowledge of the sex trade, but allowed their operators to maintain social respectability and legal protection. The success of this network demonstrates that Pompeii's sex trade wasn't just about exploitation and victimization. It was also about economic opportunity, social mobility, and the creation of alternative spaces where people excluded from mainstream society could build lives and communities. But these success stories shouldn't obscure the fundamental brutality of the system. For every Drusilla or Zmirina who managed to achieve independence, there were dozens of workers who remained trapped in circumstances of exploitation and abuse until their deaths. The skeletal remains found throughout Pompeii's brothels tell a story of systematic violence that went far beyond the sexual exploitation. Many skeletons show evidence of repeated injuries consistent with physical punishment. Malnutrition was common, suggesting that workers were fed barely enough to maintain their ability to work. Disease spread rapidly in crowded, unsanitary conditions, and medical care was minimal or non-existent. Perhaps most disturbing are the remains of children and adolescents found in these establishments. Roman law may have permitted the sexual use of young slaves, but the physical evidence suggests that many died from injuries and illnesses directly related to this abuse. These weren't abstract legal concepts, but real children whose lives were destroyed by adult greed and cruelty. The discovery of infant remains in several locations suggests that pregnancy and childbirth in these establishments were often fatal for both mother and child. Without adequate medical care or nutrition, complications that might have been manageable elsewhere became death sentences. Those infants who survived faced immediate enslavement and eventual entry into the same system that had destroyed their mothers. This cycle of exploitation was maintained through a combination of economic incentives, legal structures, and social attitudes that dehumanized certain categories of people. Slaves weren't considered fully human under Roman law, so their suffering was legally irrelevant. Foreigners were assumed to be naturally inferior, making their exploitation seem justified. The poor were blamed for their circumstances, as if poverty were evidence of moral failure rather than systemic inequality. These attitudes weren't unique to the sex trade, but permeated every aspect of Roman society. The same legal and social structures that permitted sexual exploitation also supported the gladiatorial games, agricultural slavery, and military conquest that were central to Roman civilization. The brothels of Pompeii were just one manifestation of a broader system, built on the assumption that some people existed primarily to serve the pleasure and convenience of others. Yet within this system, moments of genuine humanity persisted. The graffiti found throughout Pompeii's establishments includes not just crude commercial messages, but also expressions of love, friendship, and mutual support among workers. One inscription reads, "Sisters in sorrow, sisters in hope." Another says, "Tomorrow will be better than today." These messages remind us that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, people found ways to maintain connections, offer comfort, and preserve dignity. The workers in Pompeii's brothels weren't just victims or commodities, but complex human beings who responded to their circumstances with the full range of human emotions and behaviors. Their stories matter not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of human resilience in the face of systematic oppression. They also serve as warnings about what happens when societies construct elaborate justifications for treating certain groups of people as less than fully human. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius on that August day in 79 AD didn't just preserve buildings and artifacts. It froze in time an entire social system, complete with all its contradictions, cruelties, and occasional moments of grace. The ash that buried Pompeii also buried the stories of people like Fortunata, Taish, Drusilla, and countless others whose names we'll never know. But their stories continue to speak to us across nearly 2,000 years, challenging us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, exploitation, and human dignity. They remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism is often thinner than we'd like to believe, and that the most revealing aspects of any society are often found in the shadows rather than in the monuments and official records. As we continue to excavate and study Pompeii's remains, we're not just uncovering ancient history, we're examining the consequences of social systems that reduce human beings to commodities, that justify exploitation through legal and religious frameworks, and that allow suffering to persist as long as it remains profitable for those in power. The preservation of these stories becomes even more powerful when we consider how close they came to being lost forever. The morning of August 24th, 79 AD started like any other day in Pompeii. Workers in the entertainment district woke up, prepared for another day of serving clients, managing businesses, and navigating the complex social hierarchies that governed their lives. None of them knew they had less than 12 hours left. Archaeological evidence suggests that many establishments were operating normally when the eruption began. Coins found scattered on floors indicate that transactions were taking place. Meals were being prepared in kitchens. Beds were occupied. The business of human desire and commercial exploitation was proceeding exactly as it had for decades. But as the mountain began to rumble and ash started falling, the carefully constructed social order that governed Pompeii's sex trade began to collapse. Suddenly, The hierarchies that seemed so permanent and natural revealed themselves to be fragile human constructions that meant nothing in the face of natural disaster. Consider what happened at Asalina's establishment. When the eruption began, social conventions would normally have required that free citizens be evacuated first, then freed slaves, then property slaves last. But archaeological evidence suggests that in the chaos and terror of that day, such distinctions became meaningless. Bodies found huddled together in the building's basement include people from every social class, clinging to each other without regard for status or previous relationships. The remains of Asalina herself were found in a small storage room, clutching what appears to be a bag of coins and jewelry. But beside her was the skeleton of a young woman whose dental analysis suggests she was one of Asalina's workers. In their final moments, the successful businesswoman and the exploited slave faced death as equals, their previous relationship transformed by shared terror into something approaching human solidarity. This pattern repeats throughout the archaeological record. In establishment after establishment, the rigid social hierarchies that governed daily life dissolved as people faced the reality of imminent death. Masters and slaves, clients and workers, Romans and foreigners all became simply human beings trying to survive an incomprehensible catastrophe. The Lupanar tells a particularly haunting story. 9 bodies were found in the building, but only 3 were in the tiny cubicles where workers normally spent their time. The others were discovered in what had been common areas, suggesting that as the danger became apparent, people abandoned their assigned spaces and came together for comfort and protection. One of the most poignant discoveries was made in the building's upper level, where archaeologists found the remains of 2 people who had died holding hands. Skeletal analysis indicates one was a young woman, probably a worker, and the other was a middle-aged man who might have been a client, an owner, or simply someone who had sought shelter. Their identities don't matter as much as their final act of human connection in the face of overwhelming terror. The graffiti that covers the Lupanar's walls takes on new meaning when we consider that some of it might have been carved during those final hours. Among the usual commercial messages and crude boasts, archaeologists have found what appear to be prayers, final messages to loved ones, and desperate pleas for divine intervention. One inscription, carved with a trembling hand, reads simply, "Gods help us all." But the volcanic ash that ended so many lives also created an unprecedented historical record. The same geological forces that brought death and destruction also preserved details about daily life in ancient Pompeii that would normally have been lost to time. We can see exactly what people were doing, wearing, eating, and feeling at the moment when their world ended. This preservation allows us to understand the sex trade not as an abstract historical phenomenon, but as a lived reality involving real people with real hopes, fears, and relationships. The woman whose skeleton was found clutching a small bronze mirror wasn't just a prostitute or a slave. She was someone who cared about her appearance, who had personal possessions that mattered to her, who faced death with the same human dignity as any other person. The preservation also reveals details that challenge many modern assumptions about ancient sexuality and gender roles. Recent analysis of skeletal remains suggests that Pompeii's sex trade included more diversity than historians previously understood. Bodies found in brothels include people who appear to have been born male but lived as women, individuals whose bone structure suggests they may have been intersex, and evidence of surgical modifications that might have been performed to alter physical appearance for commercial purposes. This biological diversity was reflected in the services advertised throughout the city. Graffiti and artwork suggest that Pompeii's establishments catered to an enormous range of desires, fantasies, and sexual practices. Some of these practices would be familiar to modern audiences, while others seem bizarre or disturbing by contemporary standards. The establishment run by a woman known as Caecilia Iucunda specialized in theatrical performances that combined sexuality with entertainment. Clients didn't just purchase sexual services, but elaborate fantasy scenarios involving costumes, role-playing, and scripted interactions. Cecilia employed actors, musicians, and artists alongside traditional sex workers, creating experiences that blurred the line between theatre and prostitution. Archaeological evidence from Cecilia's establishment includes masks, costumes, musical instruments, and scripts written on wax tablets. The performances ranged from relatively tame romantic scenarios to elaborate mythological reenactments involving multiple participants and complex narratives. Clients could choose to be spectators or participants, and the most expensive options allowed them to essentially direct their own personalized productions. This theatrical approach to sexuality reveals something important about Roman culture that pure historical texts often miss. The Romans didn't just consume sexual services, they consumed sexual fantasies, elaborate narratives that allowed them to temporarily inhabit different identities and experience desires that their normal social roles wouldn't permit. Marcus Lucretius, a wealthy but physically disabled veteran, became a regular client at Cecilia's establishment, not because he needed basic sexual services, but because he craved the fantasy scenarios that allowed him to imagine himself as a powerful warrior or successful lover. The scripts found in his house, apparently written for private performances, revealed touching vulnerability beneath his public persona as a successful businessman and respected citizen. Marcus's favorite scenario involved playing a gladiator who wins the love of a beautiful captive princess. The script is surprisingly sophisticated, with genuine character development and emotional depth. For Marcus, who walked with a severe limp from a war injury and had never married, these performances provided not just sexual gratification, but emotional fulfillment and temporary escape from the limitations of his physical reality. The relationship between Marcus and the actress who usually played the princess, a woman called Fortunata Prima, evolved over several years from purely commercial to something approaching genuine affection. Their correspondence, preserved in Marcus's house, reveals a complex emotional connection that transcended their original business relationship. Fortunata Prima wrote to Marcus about her dreams of leaving the theatre and opening a small shop selling cosmetics and perfumes. Marcus responded with detailed business advice and eventually provided the financial backing for her venture. Their letters suggest that their relationship became a source of mutual support and genuine care, even though it remained grounded in the commercial transaction that had brought them together. This transformation from commercial to personal relationships appears to have been more common than historians once believed. Throughout Pompeii, archaeologists have found evidence of long-term connections between sex workers and clients that evolved into something resembling friendship, mentorship, or even love. The house of Gaius Valerius Venustus contains letters from a woman called Myrtis, who had worked in one of the harbour district establishments for several years. The correspondence spans nearly a decade and documents Myrtis's gradual transition from sex work to operating a small tavern with Gaius's financial support. But more than business partnership, their letters reveal genuine affection, shared jokes, and mutual concern for each other's welfare. Myrtis wrote to Gaius about her fears of aging and losing her attractiveness. Gaius responded with reassurances about her intelligence and business skills that went far beyond their original relationship. When Myrtis became ill, Gaius arranged for medical care and visited her daily. When she recovered, she named him in her will as her primary heir, despite having living relatives in Greece. These personal relationships complicate simplistic narratives about exploitation and victimization in the ancient sex trade. While the system was undoubtedly brutal and oppressive for many participants, it also created spaces where genuine human connections could develop, even across lines of social class, legal status, and economic power. The connections weren't limited to relationships between workers and clients. Evidence throughout Pompeii suggests that sex workers often formed tight-knit communities that provided mutual support, protection, and friendship. The women who worked in Iris's establishment, for example, appear to have developed relationships that extended far beyond their professional duties. Graffiti in their living quarters includes inside jokes, affectionate nicknames, and references to shared experiences that suggest genuine camaraderie. One wall contains what appears to be a group poem, with different verses added by different women over time. The poem celebrates friendship, mutual support, and shared dreams of eventual freedom. When one of Iris's workers, a young woman called Secunda, became pregnant, the other women pooled their resources to ensure she received adequate food and medical care during her pregnancy. After the birth, they helped arrange for the child to be fostered by a family outside the sex trade, giving the baby opportunities that would have been impossible if he had remained in the establishment. These acts of solidarity and mutual care weren't unique to Iris's establishment. Throughout Pompeii's entertainment district, archaeologists have found evidence of informal networks that provided support, protection, and alternative economic opportunities for people trying to survive within or escape from the sex trade. The networks operated through a combination of business relationships, personal friendships, and shared cultural backgrounds. Women from the same regions of the empire often worked together and looked out for each other. Former workers who had achieved independence often provided opportunities for others who were still trapped in exploitative situations. Claudia Peregrina, a former sex worker who had become a successful merchant, employed several women who were transitioning out of prostitution in her fabric and cosmetics business. Her account books, preserved by volcanic ash, show that she paid above market wages and provided housing and training that allowed her employees to develop skills for independent businesses. Claudia's success wasn't accidental. She had systematically built relationships with suppliers, clients, and other merchants that allowed her to create legitimate opportunities for women who might otherwise have had no alternatives to continued exploitation. Her business served as a bridge between the underground economy of the sex trade and the legitimate commercial world of Roman Pompeii. But Claudia's story also illustrates the constant challenges faced by people trying to escape their pasts. Despite her business success and social connections, she remained vulnerable to blackmail and social ostracism from people who knew her history. Several threatening letters found in her house suggest that former associates tried to extort money by threatening to expose her background to respectable clients. The psychological burden of maintaining a double identity took its toll. Claudia's private diary, written in Greek to conceal its contents from casual readers, reveals ongoing anxiety about discovery and deep sadness about the relationships she couldn't pursue because of her past. She wrote about watching respectable women her age marry and have families, while she remained isolated by circumstances beyond her control. Yet Claudia persisted, building her business and creating opportunities for other women because she understood that economic independence was the only real protection available to people like her. Her success inspired others and demonstrated that escape from the sex trade was possible with sufficient determination, skill, and luck. The networks of mutual support extended beyond individual businesses to include entire neighborhoods and communities. The area around the amphitheater developed an informal economy that provided alternatives to direct participation in prostitution while still serving the entertainment industry. Women in this community operated food stalls, sold souvenirs and gambling tokens, provided laundry services for travelers, and offered various forms of entertainment that didn't involve sexual services. The businesses were often owned and operated by former sex workers who had saved enough money to establish independent enterprises. This alternative economy created a buffer zone between the legitimate business world and the explicitly sexual establishments. It provided opportunities for social mobility and economic independence while allowing people to use skills and connections developed during their time in the sex trade. The community also provided social support and protection that was unavailable elsewhere in Roman society. Women who had been rejected by their birth families because of their involvement in prostitution found new families among people who shared similar experiences and understood their struggles. The bonds formed in these alternative communities were strong enough to survive even the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius. Bodies found in the amphitheatre district were often discovered in groups that included people from different establishments and businesses, suggesting that when disaster struck, these informal communities came together to face death as they had faced life, supporting each other through the final crisis. But the eruption also revealed the ultimate fragility of all these human connections and social arrangements. The elaborate networks of relationships, businesses, and communities that people had spent years building were destroyed in a matter of hours. The careful social distinctions that had seemed so important were rendered meaningless by the democratic nature of volcanic ash, which buried rich and poor, free and slave, respectable and disreputable with equal indifference. The archaeological record captures this moment of universal vulnerability with heartbreaking clarity. In house after house, establishment after establishment, we find evidence of people who spent their final hours not according to social conventions or economic relationships, but according to the most basic human impulses for connection, comfort, and mutual support. The villa of Marcus Fabius Rufus, one of Pompeii's wealthiest citizens, contains the remains of the entire household, including family members, slaves, and several people who appear to have been sex workers from nearby establishments who had sought shelter when the eruption began. In death, they were all simply human beings who had tried unsuccessfully to escape the same natural disaster. This democratic quality of the volcanic destruction creates a unique historical record that doesn't privilege the experiences of the wealthy and powerful over those of the marginalized and exploited. The ash preserved the stories of slaves and senators with equal fidelity, creating an archive of human experience that includes voices usually silenced by conventional historical sources. The preservation is so complete that we can sometimes reconstruct the final conversations and interactions between people who died together. In one small establishment near the city walls, archaeologists found evidence suggesting that a group of women spent their final hours comforting a younger colleague who was terrified by the volcanic activity. Empty wine cups and the remains of food suggest they shared a final meal while trying to maintain hope that the danger would pass. The younger woman's body was found surrounded by small personal objects, jewelry, coins, and what appears to have been a letter from her family in a distant province. The other women had apparently helped her gather these possessions, ensuring that she would face death with reminders of the people and places that had given her life meaning. These final acts of kindness and solidarity remind us that even within systems of exploitation and dehumanization, people found ways to preserve their humanity and extend compassion to others. The sex workers of Pompeii weren't just victims of historical forces beyond their control. They were complex human beings who responded to their circumstances with the full range of human emotions and behaviors, including remarkable resilience, creativity, and care for others. Their stories challenge us to think more deeply about the relationship between individual agency and systemic oppression, between personal responsibility and structural inequality, between the choices people make and the circumstances that limit those choices. They remind us that history isn't just about kings and battles and grand political movements, but about the daily experiences of ordinary people trying to survive and find meaning within the constraints of their time and place. As we prepare to explore the final hours of Pompeii and the immediate aftermath of the eruption, we carry with us the voices of people like Aselina, Taisha, Drusilla, Marcus, Fortunata Prima, and countless others whose names we'll never know, but whose stories have been preserved by the same volcanic forces that ended their lives. Their experiences illuminate not just the ancient world, but our own contemporary struggles with exploitation, inequality, and the commodification of human sexuality. They remind us that the fundamental questions about human dignity, economic justice, and social responsibility that we grapple with today are not new. but have been central to human societies for thousands of years. The ash that buried Pompeii also preserved these questions for future generations to examine and attempt to answer. As we continue to excavate and study the remains of this ancient city, we're not just uncovering the past, but confronting ongoing challenges about how societies should organize themselves and treat their most vulnerable members. The morning of August 24th began with subtle tremors that most residents dismissed as routine seismic activity. The Campanian region had always been geologically restless, and minor earthquakes were so common that people barely noticed them anymore. But in the establishments throughout Pompeii's entertainment districts, this particular morning would reveal character and humanity in ways that normal circumstances never could. At the luxurious villa that housed Livia Antonia's exclusive courtesan business, the tremors interrupted what should have been a typical day of preparation. Livia had built her reputation serving only the wealthiest clients, senators and merchants who paid premium prices for discretion and sophistication. Her establishment was more like a private club than a brothel, with marble floors, imported silk hangings, and gardens where clients could conduct business while enjoying entertainment. But Livia's success hadn't made her forget her own origins. She had started as a slave in one of the harbour district's most brutal establishments, enduring years of exploitation before a wealthy patron purchased her freedom and set her up in business. Now, at 35, she employed a dozen women and had accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of her life. The earthquake that morning was stronger than usual, strong enough to crack the plaster on several walls and send expensive pottery crashing to the floor. But what distinguished Livia's response from that of other business owners was her immediate concern for her employees' safety rather than her property damage. While other establishment owners focused on securing their valuables and assessing financial losses, Livia gathered her workers and began discussing evacuation plans. She had survived enough disasters, both natural and human, to recognize when normal precautions might not be sufficient. The mountain had been restless for days, and she trusted her instincts more than official reassurances about public safety. Her decision to take the seismic activity seriously probably saved several lives. When the major eruption began later that morning, Livia's household was already prepared to evacuate quickly. But their escape route took them through the city's entertainment district, where they encountered scenes of chaos and desperation that revealed both the worst and best of human nature. In the narrow streets near the Lupanar, panic had already begun to spread as ash started falling more heavily. The building's owner, a man named Gaius Mummius, who had never shown any concern for his workers' welfare, had fled immediately with his personal valuables, abandoning the women trapped inside to fend for themselves. But Livia stopped her own escape to help. Despite having no legal obligation or business relationship with the Lupanar's workers, she recognized their desperate situation and couldn't simply walk past. Her group broke down the building's main door, which had been locked from the outside, and helped evacuate 7 terrified women who had been trapped in the basement. The rescue wasn't without cost. The delay meant that Livia's group now faced much more dangerous conditions as ashfall increased and toxic gases began to affect breathing. Several members of her party, including Livia herself, began showing signs of respiratory distress that would prove fatal within hours. Yet even as her own situation became desperate, Livia continued making decisions that prioritized others' welfare over her own survival. When the group reached a fork in the evacuation route, she chose the path that would take them past other establishments where people might need help, rather than the more direct route to safety outside the city. The archaeological evidence suggests that Livia's final hours were spent moving from building to building in the entertainment district, helping coordinate evacuations and providing leadership in a situation where official authority had completely broken down. Her body was found in a doorway, apparently having collapsed while trying to help an elderly woman who couldn't walk quickly enough to keep up with the evacuation. The woman Livia died trying to save was Antonia Canis, a 70-year-old former slave who had spent nearly 5 decades working in Pompeii's brothels. Antonia had purchased her freedom years earlier and now operated a small tavern that served the entertainment district's workers and clients. She was beloved by younger women who sought her advice about navigating the dangers and opportunities of their profession. When the evacuation began, Antonia's age and poor health made it impossible for her to move quickly enough to escape the advancing ash cloud. Younger people in her neighborhood could have abandoned her and saved themselves, but instead they formed a protective group around her, taking turns carrying her when she couldn't walk and sharing their limited supplies of water and cloth to filter the increasingly toxic air. The group's progress was agonizingly slow, but they refused to leave Antonia behind. Their loyalty wasn't based on economic calculations or legal obligations, but on genuine affection for a woman who had shown them kindness and wisdom during their most vulnerable moments. She had lent money without interest when they needed medical care, had provided safe shelter when they fled abusive owners, and had taught them practical skills for surviving in a hostile world. Antonia's own response to the crisis revealed the strength of character that had earned such devotion. Despite her physical frailty and growing awareness that her presence endangered the entire group, she never asked to be abandoned. Instead, she used her knowledge of the city's layout to guide them toward escape routes that avoided the worst of the ashfall and toxic gas accumulation. Her final contribution came when the group reached a collapsed building that blocked their planned escape route. Antonia recognized the location as a property she had worked in decades earlier, and she remembered a hidden passage that connected the building's basement to the city's drainage system. The passage was dangerous and partially flooded, but it offered their only hope of reaching safety. Antonia insisted on entering the passage first, despite her age and weakness, because she was the only one who knew the route well enough to navigate it in near total darkness. The decision was both heroic and tragic, because her physical condition made it almost certain that she wouldn't survive the journey, even if she successfully guided others to safety. The group spent precious time arguing about her plan, with several younger women insisting they would rather die together than let Antonia sacrifice herself for their survival. But Antonia finally convinced them by pointing out that her death was already inevitable given her age and the toxic conditions, while their deaths would be a waste of lives that could still contribute something meaningful to the world. Her logic was brutal but undeniable, and it reflected a lifetime of making hard choices in impossible circumstances. Antonia had survived 5 decades in Pompeii's sex trade by learning to assess situations realistically and act decisively when necessary. The same skills that had kept her alive through countless personal crises now enabled her to make the ultimate sacrifice with clear-eyed determination. The passage was even more treacherous than Antonia had remembered. Decades of neglect had caused partial collapses that made navigation extremely difficult, and the toxic gases were more concentrated in the enclosed space. But her memory of the route proved accurate, and she successfully guided the group through the most dangerous sections before her strength finally gave out. Antonia's body was found at a junction where the passage connected to the main drainage system, just a few hundred yards from an exit that would have led to safety outside the city walls. She had died within sight of successful escape, but her sacrifice had enabled 6 younger women to reach safety and survive the disaster. The survival stories began to multiply as news of successful escape routes spread through the remaining population. But for every person who found safety, many others were trapped by circumstances beyond their control, or by their refusal to abandon people who couldn't save themselves. In the establishment run by Marcus Decidius, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding. Marcus had built his business around the fantasy that his workers were willing participants rather than coerced slaves. He paid them slightly better than other owners, gave them more comfortable living conditions, and maintained the fiction that they could leave whenever they chose. The fiction was maintained through a system of debt bondage that made it practically impossible for workers to accumulate enough money to purchase their freedom. But Marcus genuinely believed he was a benevolent employer who treated his people fairly. When the evacuation began, This self-deception created a crisis that revealed the true nature of their relationship. Marcus expected his workers to evacuate with him as a group, under his leadership and protection. But several of the women saw the chaos as an opportunity to escape permanently, not just from the volcanic disaster, but from their bondage to Marcus. The conflict between his expectations and their desires created delays and confusion that put everyone's survival at risk. Fabia Maxima, who had worked for Marcus for over 3 years, had been planning her escape for months and had hidden money and supplies in preparation for an opportunity exactly like this. When Marcus announced the evacuation plan, she tried to convince the other women to scatter in different directions, rather than staying together as a group that could be easily tracked and recaptured if they survived. But Marcus interpreted their hesitation as loyalty and gratitude rather than fear and calculation. He insisted that staying together was the safest option and became increasingly angry when some workers expressed reluctance to follow his leadership. The argument wasted precious time as conditions outside became more dangerous. The situation was further complicated by the presence of 2 pregnant women in the establishment. Claudia Marcella was 8 months pregnant and could barely walk, while Junior Tatula was in early labor that had been triggered by the stress and physical exertion of the crisis. Both women needed immediate medical attention that wasn't available during the evacuation. Marcus faced a choice that exposed the contradictions in his self-image as a caring employer. Helping the pregnant women would slow the entire group's escape and reduce everyone's chances of survival. Abandoning them would reveal his true priorities and destroy the fiction that he cared about his workers' welfare rather than just their economic value. His initial decision was to leave both women behind with a single attendant, while the rest of the group evacuated quickly. But Fabia Maxima and several other workers refused to abandon their pregnant colleagues, creating a standoff that paralyzed the entire evacuation effort. The delay proved fatal for Marcus himself, who died of asphyxiation while still arguing with his workers about evacuation priorities. His final words, according to survivors, were complaints about their ingratitude and disloyalty, rather than expressions of concern for their safety or his own mortality. But his death didn't end the crisis for the women in his establishment. Without his connections and resources, they faced the disaster with even fewer options than before. The pregnant women couldn't travel quickly enough to escape the advancing ash cloud, and the other workers had to choose between abandoning them and facing almost certain death together. Their decision revealed moral courage that contrasted sharply with Marcus's self-serving behavior. Despite having no legal or economic obligations to each other, the women chose to stay together and face whatever consequences followed. They moved Claudia and Junior to the most protected room in the building, gathered what supplies they could find, and prepared to wait out the disaster. The choice was both admirable and tragic, because it probably sealed their fate. Archaeological evidence suggests that all 9 women died together in the building's basement, apparently from carbon monoxide poisoning, as toxic gases accumulated in the enclosed space. But they died as free agents who had chosen their own priorities, rather than as property following their owners' commands. Their final hours were spent caring for each other with remarkable tenderness and dignity. Claudia gave birth successfully, and the infant survived for several hours before succumbing to the same toxic gases that killed the adults. The baby's body was found cradled in the arms of Fabia Maxima, who had apparently spent her final moments providing whatever comfort she could to the newborn. The scene, preserved in perfect detail by volcanic ash, provides one of the most poignant examples of human solidarity triumphing over dehumanizing circumstances. These women had been treated as property, exploited for their sexuality, and denied basic human rights. But when faced with ultimate crisis, they chose to affirm their humanity through acts of mutual care and sacrifice. Their story was repeated throughout Pompeii's entertainment district, where the breakdown of normal social order revealed the moral character that people had developed despite, or perhaps because of, their experiences with systematic oppression. Workers who had been trained to compete with each other for clients' attention instead cooperated to maximize everyone's chances of survival. In the harbour district, where conditions were particularly dangerous due to toxic gas concentrations near the water, a remarkable rescue effort emerged from the chaos. Sextus Pompeius Axiochus, a retired gladiator who operated a small tavern catering to dock workers and sailors, organized an evacuation convoy that saved dozens of lives. Sextus had survived 20 years in the arena by learning to assess dangerous situations quickly and act decisively under pressure. When the volcanic eruption began, he immediately recognized that the harbour district's low elevation and poor drainage made it a death trap for anyone who remained. But instead of simply fleeing to safety, he began moving through the neighborhood to warn others and coordinate group evacuations. His efforts focused particularly on the most vulnerable residents, people who lacked the resources or connections to organize their own escapes. Many of these were women working in the district's cheapest establishments, elderly former gladiators who had been discarded when their fighting days ended, and foreign slaves who had no understanding of local geography or escape routes. Sextus's own background as a former slave gave him credibility with people who had learned to distrust authority figures and official rescue efforts. He understood their fears about being recaptured or punished if they left their assigned positions, and he was able to convince them that the volcanic disaster created a genuine emergency that justified breaking normal rules. The convoy he organized included over 40 people from throughout the harbour district. They traveled together for mutual protection and support, sharing limited supplies of food and water while helping those who couldn't maintain the pace necessary for escape. Sextus used his knowledge of gladiatorial training to maintain group discipline and morale during the difficult journey. But the convoy's success wasn't just due to Sextus's leadership. The participants themselves demonstrated remarkable cooperation and mutual support, despite having no previous relationships or shared interests beyond their common desire to survive. Former rivals in the sex trade helped each other navigate difficult terrain. Clients and workers who had maintained purely commercial relationships shared their resources without expectation of repayment. The transformation was particularly striking among a group of women from competing establishments who had previously regarded each other as economic threats. Cassia Prima, Flavia Secunda, and Julia Tertia had spent years trying to steal clients from each other and undermine each other's reputations. But during the evacuation, they formed a mutual support network that enabled all three to survive when they might have died alone. Their cooperation began with practical necessities, sharing food and taking turns helping an injured member of the group. But it evolved into genuine friendship based on recognition of their shared experiences and common humanity. The crisis had stripped away the artificial competition that normally governed their relationships and revealed the natural solidarity that connected people facing similar challenges. The convoy's journey to safety took over 6 hours through increasingly dangerous conditions. Several members collapsed from exhaustion or respiratory distress and had to be carried by others. Toxic gas concentrations forced detours that added miles to their route. At several points, the group faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable and were tempted to abandon the collective effort in favor of individual survival attempts. But Sextus's leadership and the group's growing sense of solidarity kept them together through each crisis. When an elderly man named Gaius Oppius collapsed and couldn't continue walking, they improvised a stretcher and took turns carrying him. When a young woman named Tertia became hysterical with fear, others surrounded her with comfort and encouragement until she could regain her composure. The most severe test came when they encountered a group of city officials who were trying to prevent people from leaving Pompeii without proper authorization. The officials, apparently more concerned with maintaining bureaucratic control than saving lives, demanded documentation that most convoy members couldn't provide. Sextus negotiated with the officials, using his reputation as a former gladiator and his connections with wealthy patrons to vouch for the entire group. But the negotiations took precious time while conditions continued to deteriorate, and several convoy members began showing signs of serious respiratory distress from prolonged exposure to volcanic gases. The standoff was finally resolved when one of the officials recognized several convoy members as workers from establishments he had patronized. His embarrassment at being identified as a client in front of his colleagues led him to expedite the authorization process rather than risk further exposure of his personal activities. The incident revealed how the normal hierarchies and moral judgments that governed daily life in Pompeii became meaningless in the face of genuine crisis. Officials who normally condemned the sex trade as immoral were revealed as regular participants. Workers who were usually treated as social outcasts suddenly became fellow human beings, deserving of protection and assistance. By mid-afternoon, Sextus's convoy had successfully reached safety outside the city walls. All 42 members survived the initial evacuation, though several died in the following days from complications related to gas inhalation and physical exhaustion. The survivors formed lasting bonds that transcended their previous social roles and economic relationships. Cassia Prima, Flavia Secunda, and Julia Tertia remained close friends for the rest of their lives, eventually pooling their resources to establish a small business in a neighboring city. Their success was built partly on practical skills learned during their time in Pompeii's sex trade, but more importantly, on the trust and cooperation they had developed during their shared survival experience. Their story illustrates how extreme circumstances can reveal human potential that remains hidden under normal conditions. The same people who had been trapped in cycles of competition and exploitation were capable of remarkable generosity and mutual support when their situation demanded it. But not all evacuation attempts ended successfully. Throughout the city, people faced impossible choices between personal survival and loyalty to others who couldn't save themselves. The decisions they made in these moments revealed character traits that had been shaped by years of navigating Pompeii's complex social and economic hierarchies. In the establishment known as the House of the Vetii, which catered to wealthy clients seeking exotic experiences, the evacuation was complicated by the presence of several foreign slaves who had been brought to Pompeii specifically for their unusual cultural backgrounds and physical characteristics. These individuals were extremely valuable property, but they were also completely dependent on their owners for survival because they had no knowledge of local language, geography, or social customs. The owner, Marcus Vettius Conviva, faced a dilemma that exposed the fundamental contradictions in his relationship with these slaves. As valuable property, they represented a significant financial investment that he couldn't afford to lose. But as human beings in mortal danger, they needed immediate help that he might not be able to provide without risking his own survival. His initial plan was to evacuate with his most valuable slaves while leaving the others behind to fend for themselves. But the foreign slaves couldn't survive without guidance and protection, and abandoning them would essentially be murder. Yet helping them would slow his own escape and reduce his chances of preserving his wealth and status. The moral complexity was further complicated by the relationships that had developed between Marcus and some of his slaves over years of intimate contact. While he had never questioned his legal right to own and exploit them, he had developed genuine affection for several individuals whose personalities and histories had engaged his interest and sympathy. Particularly problematic was his relationship with a woman called Roxana, who had been captured during a military campaign in the eastern provinces and brought to Pompeii because of her exotic appearance and alleged knowledge of ancient Persian sexual practices. Over 3 years, Roxana had learned enough Latin to communicate effectively with Marcus, and their interactions had evolved from purely commercial to something approaching friendship. Marcus knew that Roxana's survival depended entirely on his protection, but he also knew that her presence would make his own escape much more difficult. She was unfamiliar with the terrain outside Pompeii, couldn't communicate effectively with other Romans, and would be completely vulnerable to recapture or worse if separated from him during the chaos. His decision to include Roxana in his evacuation party was based partly on economic calculation, since she represented a substantial financial investment, but also on personal attachment that he had never expected to develop. The choice committed him to a more dangerous and uncertain escape route, but it also preserved a relationship that had become genuinely meaningful to him. The evacuation party included Marcus, Roxana, 2 other foreign slaves, and 3 Roman slaves who had specific skills that made them valuable. The group's composition created communication problems and cultural conflicts that made cooperation difficult, even under the best circumstances. The foreign slaves were terrified by the volcanic activity, which they interpreted through their own cultural frameworks, rather than Roman understanding of natural phenomena. Roxana believed the eruption was divine punishment for her participation in activities that violated her original religious training. The others had similar supernatural explanations that increased their panic and made rational decision-making nearly impossible. Marcus found himself serving not just as evacuation leader, but as translator, cultural mediator, and psychological counselor for people whose backgrounds he barely understood. The responsibility was overwhelming, especially as physical conditions became more dangerous, and his own survival instincts urged him to abandon the group and flee alone. The crisis deepened when one of the foreign slaves, a young man from Germanic territories, suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown. He became convinced that the volcanic eruption was connected to his enslavement, and that escape was impossible because the gods were punishing him specifically. His terror infected the other slaves and created a panic that threatened to destroy group cohesion entirely. Marcus's response revealed both his limitations and his genuine humanity. He couldn't provide the cultural or religious comfort that the Germanic slave needed, but he did offer practical protection and refused to abandon him, despite the danger this created for everyone else. The decision probably saved the young man's life, but it also sealed Marcus's own fate by delaying their escape until conditions became unsurvivable. Archaeological evidence suggests that Marcus's group died together in a small building where they had sought shelter when the ashfall became too heavy to continue traveling. Their bodies were found arranged in a way that suggests they spent their final hours providing mutual comfort rather than competing for individual survival. Marcus's body was discovered with his arms around Roxana, apparently having used his own clothing to provide her with additional protection from the toxic gases. The gesture was both touching and futile, since both died from the same causes within minutes of each other, but it represented a final affirmation of human connection that transcended the legal and economic relationships that had originally brought them together. The Germanic slave's body was found nearby, clutched in the arms of one of the Roman slaves, who had apparently tried to calm his terror during their final moments. The scene preserved a moment of compassion that contradicted every assumption about how slaves were expected to treat each other in Roman society. These intimate glimpses of people's final hours provide unique insights into relationships that normally remained hidden beneath formal social roles. The volcanic ash preserved moments of genuine human connection that might otherwise have been lost to history, revealing the emotional complexity that existed even within systems of exploitation and oppression. But the preservation also captured scenes of cruelty and abandonment that demonstrate the worst aspects of human nature under extreme stress. Not everyone rose to heroic standards when faced with mortal danger, and some people's responses revealed character flaws that had been concealed by normal social conventions. In the luxurious villa owned by Gaius Elias Nigidius, the evacuation began with careful planning and adequate resources, but deteriorated into chaos and betrayal as conditions worsened. Gaius had accumulated enormous wealth through investments in various entertainment businesses, and he maintained a household that included family members, personal slaves, business associates, and several high-class courtesans who lived on his property. When the volcanic activity intensified, Gaius organized what should have been a model evacuation. He had sufficient transportation, supplies, and knowledge of escape routes to ensure everyone's survival if the plan had been executed properly. But his leadership failed when the crisis demanded genuine sacrifice and moral courage rather than just logistical planning. The breakdown began when the evacuation convoy encountered more dangerous conditions than anticipated. Toxic gas concentrations forced detours that depleted their supplies and exhausted their transportation animals. Several members of the group began showing signs of serious respiratory distress that would require medical attention if they were to survive. Gaius's response was to begin abandoning the most vulnerable members of his household in order to preserve resources for those he considered most important. The decisions were presented as practical necessities, but they revealed a hierarchy of value that placed family members and valuable slaves above other human beings who had served him faithfully for years. The first to be abandoned was an elderly slave named Philemon, who had managed Gaius's business accounts for over 2 decades. When Philemon collapsed from exhaustion and couldn't continue walking, Gaius decided that carrying him would endanger everyone else's survival. The decision was probably correct from a purely practical standpoint, but it was made without consulting Philemon or the other slaves who had worked alongside him for years. Philemon's abandonment created resentment and fear among the remaining slaves, who realized that their years of loyal service meant nothing when their survival became inconvenient. Several began making their own plans for escape, correctly anticipating that Gaius would abandon them as well if circumstances required further sacrifices. The next crisis came when one of the courtesans, a woman named Clodia Metella, who had lived in Gaius's household for 3 years, became seriously ill from gas inhalation. Clodia had been more than just a business associate. She had served as Gaius's companion and advisor, and their relationship had involved genuine affection and mutual respect. But when Clodia's illness began slowing the group's progress, Gaius faced the same choice he had made with Philemon. His decision to leave her behind with minimal supplies and no protection revealed that even his most intimate relationships were ultimately subordinate to his own survival interests. Clodia's abandonment broke the last bonds of loyalty that had held the evacuation group together. The remaining slaves and courtesans realized that Gaius would sacrifice any of them to preserve his own life, and they began planning independent escapes rather than trusting his leadership. The group's disintegration accelerated when they encountered a checkpoint where Roman officials were demanding documentation and payment for passage to safety. Gaius had sufficient resources to secure passage for everyone, but he chose to use his money only for himself and his immediate family members. The abandoned slaves and courtesans were left to negotiate their own passage or find alternative escape routes without resources or connections. Most probably died in the attempt, though archaeological evidence makes it impossible to trace their individual fates with certainty. Gaius himself survived the initial evacuation, but died within a year from complications related to gas inhalation and the stress of losing most of his wealth and property. His survival was purchased through the abandonment of people who had depended on his protection, and the moral weight of those decisions apparently contributed to his rapid decline even after reaching physical safety. His story serves as a counterpoint to the examples of heroism and solidarity that emerged elsewhere in Pompeii during the crisis. It demonstrates that extreme circumstances could reveal moral cowardice and selfishness just as easily as they could inspire courage and sacrifice. The contrast becomes even more striking when compared to the behavior of people who had much less to lose, but chose to risk everything for others' welfare. Throughout the entertainment district, individuals with minimal district, individuals with no legal obligations or social standing, repeatedly chose to help strangers at the cost of their own survival chances. Consider the actions of Gaius Cornelius Felix, a former gladiator turned bodyguard who worked for one of the mid-tier establishments near the theatre district. Felix had purchased his freedom after surviving 8 years in the arena, and he had built a modest but secure life providing protection services to businesses that couldn't afford more expensive security arrangements. When the evacuation began, Felix's employer fled immediately without paying his final wages or providing any assistance to the workers who depended on the business for their livelihoods. Felix had no legal or economic reason to remain in the dangerous area, and his combat training gave him better survival skills than most civilians attempting to escape the city. But instead of fleeing, Felix spent his final hours moving through the neighborhood's most dangerous areas, helping coordinate evacuations from buildings where people had become trapped by debris or panic. His military experience proved invaluable in maintaining order and morale among groups of terrified civilians who had no experience with crisis management. Felix's most significant intervention came when he discovered that a building collapse had trapped several people in a basement brothel. The structure was unstable and could collapse further at any moment, but the trapped individuals would certainly die if no rescue attempt was made. Working with a small group of volunteers, Felix organized a dangerous excavation effort that eventually freed 6 people from the rubble. The rescue took over 2 hours of exhausting labor under increasingly hazardous conditions, and it probably prevented Felix from reaching safety outside the city walls. His body was found the next morning in an alley near the collapsed building, apparently having died from gas inhalation after ensuring that the rescued individuals had successfully joined an evacuation convoy heading toward the city gates. Felix had traded his own survival for the lives of people he had never met and would never see again. The contrast between Felix's selfless behavior and Gaius's calculated abandonment of his dependents illustrates how moral character often operated independently of social status or economic resources in ancient Pompeii. The slave-turned-bodyguard demonstrated nobility that the wealthy villa owner completely lacked. Similar examples multiplied throughout the city as the crisis deepened. People, with every reason to focus solely on their own survival, instead chose to help others who had no claim on their assistance except shared humanity. In the Suburana district, a neighborhood that housed many of the city's poorest residents and cheapest establishments, a remarkable community response emerged from the chaos. Rather than every individual or family attempting separate escapes, the entire neighborhood organized collective evacuations that maximized everyone's chances of survival. The coordination was led by Lucius Cessius Bassus, a freedman who operated a small tavern that served as an unofficial community center for the area's residents. Bassus had lived in the neighborhood for over 15 years and knew virtually everyone who lived or worked there, from the most successful business owners to the most desperate street workers. When the volcanic activity intensified, Bassus immediately began organizing group evacuations based on his intimate knowledge of each person's capabilities, resources, and needs. He matched people who had transportation with those who needed help traveling. He paired individuals with local knowledge with newcomers who didn't understand the city's geography. He arranged for the strongest and healthiest residents to assist those who were elderly, disabled, or ill. The organizational effort was remarkably sophisticated considering the time constraints and dangerous conditions under which it operated. Bassus created multiple evacuation routes to avoid overcrowding and reduce the risk that a single obstacle would trap large numbers of people. He established rally points where separated individuals could reunite with their groups. He even arranged for food and water distribution to sustain people during what would be a long and difficult journey to safety. But perhaps most importantly, Bassus insisted that the evacuations include everyone in the neighborhood, regardless of their social status, legal standing, or ability to contribute resources to the effort. Slaves evacuated alongside their owners. Foreign workers received the same assistance as Roman citizens, and people who couldn't afford to pay for help were provided with services funded by wealthier neighbors. This inclusive approach reflected values that were unusual in Roman society, where hierarchical distinctions normally determined who received help during emergencies. But the Suburana neighborhood had always operated according to different principles, partly because its residents' marginal status had created bonds of mutual dependence that transcended legal and economic categories. The neighborhood's sex workers, tavern employees, small merchants, and casual laborers had learned to rely on each other for protection, economic opportunities, and social support that weren't available through official channels. Their informal networks of cooperation had developed over years of shared experiences with poverty, exploitation, and social exclusion. When disaster struck, these existing relationships provided a foundation for collective action that proved more effective than the individual survival strategies pursued by wealthier and more socially prominent citizens. The neighborhood's residents trusted each other because they had proven their reliability through countless smaller crises and mutual assistance arrangements. The evacuation succeeded in saving over 200 people who might have died if left to fend for themselves individually. But the success came at enormous personal cost for Bassus and other community leaders who sacrificed their own safety to ensure that others reached the evacuation points and maintained group cohesion during the dangerous journey. Bassus himself died just outside the city walls, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the physical and emotional stress of coordinating such a massive rescue effort. His body was found surrounded by personal belongings that other evacuees had dropped during their flight, suggesting that he had spent his final moments collecting and protecting items that would help survivors rebuild their lives. The community's response to his death revealed the depth of affection and gratitude that his leadership had inspired. Despite their own desperate circumstances, the survivors organized an impromptu funeral ceremony that honored Bassus's sacrifice and committed the group to maintaining the mutual support relationships he had fostered. Many of the survivors remained together after reaching safety, forming new communities that preserved the cooperative values they had developed in Pompeii. Their success in rebuilding their lives was built partly on practical skills and resources they had salvaged from the disaster, but more importantly, on the social bonds and trust relationships that had enabled their survival. The Suburana neighborhood's collective evacuation became a model that other refugee communities tried to replicate as they struggled to rebuild after losing everything in the volcanic destruction. The success demonstrated that cooperation and mutual support could be more valuable than individual wealth or social status when communities faced existential threats. But the neighborhood's achievement also highlighted how unusual such cooperation was in Roman society. Most of Pompeii's residents attempted individual escapes that often failed because people lacked the resources, knowledge, or social connections necessary for successful evacuation under dangerous conditions. The contrast was particularly stark in the city's wealthier districts, where residents had better individual resources but weaker community bonds. Many wealthy families had the means to organize effective evacuations, but lacked the social relationships that would have enabled them to coordinate with neighbors or assist people who needed help. The result was a series of individual tragedies that might have been prevented if wealthier citizens had been willing or able to cooperate as effectively as the Suburana neighborhood's residents. Family after family died in isolation, surrounded by resources that could have saved lives if shared with others facing similar dangers. The villa of Marcus Appidius Hymenaeus provides a tragic example of how individual wealth and social status failed to provide adequate protection against the volcanic disaster. Marcus had accumulated enormous riches through real estate investments that included several entertainment establishments, and his household included dozens of slaves, freedmen, and business associates. When the evacuation began, Marcus had sufficient resources to ensure everyone's survival if he had been willing to share them appropriately. He owned multiple wagons and draft animals, had stockpiled food and water for emergencies, and maintained good relationships with officials who could facilitate passage through checkpoints and obstacles. But Marcus's evacuation plan was designed to preserve his wealth and property rather than maximize human survival. He spent precious time trying to transport valuable possessions that slowed the entire group's progress and exhausted their transportation capacity. He insisted on following routes that would protect his business interests rather than choosing paths that would ensure the fastest escape from dangerous areas. Most critically, Marcus refused to accept additional evacuees who sought to join his well-supplied convoy, apparently fearing that helping strangers would reduce his own family's chances of survival or compromise his ability to preserve his wealth. The decision condemned dozens of people to death, who could have been saved with minimal additional risk or expense. the evacuation's failure was as much moral as practical. Marcus's group had the resources to succeed, but lacked the leadership and solidarity necessary to implement their advantages effectively. Internal conflicts over priorities and decision-making authority paralyzed the group when quick action was essential. The breakdown accelerated when several family members began questioning Marcus's judgment and demanding different evacuation strategies. His authority, which had never been seriously challenged during normal times, crumbled under the pressure of life and death decision-making. The resulting arguments and power struggles wasted time that could have been used for escape. By the time the group reached consensus on evacuation priorities, conditions had deteriorated beyond the point where even their superior resources could ensure survival. They died together in a roadside inn, where they had stopped to rest, apparently overcome by toxic gases, while still arguing about whether to continue the evacuation or wait for conditions to improve. Archaeological evidence suggests that Marcus spent his final hours trying to hide his most valuable possessions, rather than seeking medical attention for family members who were showing signs of serious gas poisoning. His priorities remained focused on wealth preservation, even when such concerns had become completely meaningless. The scene preserved by volcanic ash captures a moment of profound moral failure that contrasts sharply with the heroism and solidarity displayed by people who had much less to lose. Marcus's family died surrounded by luxury goods and financial instruments that couldn't save their lives, while people with no resources beyond mutual cooperation successfully escaped to safety. The contrast became even more poignant when rescue workers discovered that Marcus's convoy had passed within a few hundred yards of the Suburana neighborhood's evacuation route. If he had been willing to cooperate with Bassus's community organization efforts, his resources combined with their social coordination might have created an evacuation success that could have saved hundreds of additional lives. But the social barriers that separated wealthy Romans from their poorer neighbors proved impossible to overcome, even in the face of shared mortal danger. Marcus couldn't imagine accepting leadership from a freedman tavern keeper, and Bassus couldn't offer assistance to someone whose social status and wealth would have disrupted his community's egalitarian approach to crisis management. The failure of cooperation across class lines was repeated throughout Pompeii as the disaster unfolded. People who might have survived by combining their different resources and capabilities instead died separately because Roman social hierarchies made effective cooperation impossible, even when survival depended on it. Yet some individuals managed to transcend these social barriers through personal relationships that had developed over years of interaction across class boundaries. The entertainment industry, despite its exploitation and dehumanization, had also created unusual opportunities for people from different social backgrounds to form connections that transcended normal hierarchical distinctions. The evacuation story of Gaius Omidia Quadratilla illustrates how these cross-class relationships could enable survival when official social structures failed completely. Gaius was a wealthy merchant who had developed genuine friendships with several people who worked in establishments he patronized regularly. Unlike customers who maintained purely commercial relationships with sex workers, Gaius had taken interest in the personal lives and individual circumstances of people whose services he purchased. He had learned their real names rather than just their professional identities, had inquired about their families and backgrounds, and had occasionally provided assistance with problems that went beyond their business transactions. When the evacuation began, Gaius didn't just flee with his immediate family and household slaves. He also sought out several of the workers whose friendship he valued, offering them places in his evacuation convoy, despite the additional risks and expenses this created. The offer was complicated by the fact that some of these individuals were legally bound to other owners who hadn't given permission for their departure. Gaius's decision to help them escape could have been interpreted as theft of valuable property, with severe legal consequences if he survived the disaster and was later prosecuted. But Gaius chose to prioritize personal relationships over legal technicalities. reasoning that the volcanic emergency created moral obligations that superseded normal property rights. His evacuation convoy included not just his own family and slaves, but also several sex workers, their children, and even some of their friends and relatives who had no previous connection to Gaius. The expanded group created logistical challenges that probably reduced everyone's chances of individual survival. More people meant slower travel, greater consumption of supplies, and increased likelihood of conflicts that could destroy group cohesion. But it also created a more diverse set of skills and knowledge that proved valuable when the convoy encountered unexpected obstacles. The sex workers' familiarity with Pompeii's back streets and unofficial gathering places enabled the group to avoid checkpoints and dangerous areas that would have delayed or stopped a more conventional evacuation route. Their experience with managing difficult and potentially violent clients proved invaluable when the convoy encountered desperate people who tried to steal supplies or force their way into the group. Most importantly, their networks of relationships throughout the entertainment district provided access to information about conditions and escape routes that wasn't available through official channels. Workers in different establishments had maintained communication systems that enabled rapid sharing of information about which areas were safest and which evacuation routes were most likely to succeed. Gaius's convoy benefited from this underground information network in ways that enabled their successful escape when many wealthier and better equipped groups failed to reach safety. The social connections he had developed through years of patronizing entertainment establishments provided practical advantages that his wealth and official status couldn't duplicate. The success came at personal cost for Gaius, who lost most of his property and business investments when he chose evacuation over immediate survival. But the relationships he had nurtured across social boundaries became the foundation for a new community that survived and prospered long after the volcanic disaster had ended. The convoy's success enabled 23 people to escape Pompeii alive, including several who established businesses in neighboring cities using skills and connections they had developed in the entertainment trade. Their survival stories became part of a broader pattern of social transformation that emerged from the disaster's aftermath. But not every cross-class relationship proved strong enough to survive the ultimate test of shared mortal danger. The volcanic crisis revealed which connections were based on genuine mutual respect and which were simply convenient commercial arrangements that dissolved when circumstances changed. Marcus Holconius Priscus had maintained what appeared to be close relationships with several women who worked in high-end establishments throughout the city. He was a regular client who paid generously, treated workers with apparent kindness, and even provided financial assistance when they faced personal emergencies. But when the evacuation began, Marcus's true priorities became clear. Despite his resources and previous expressions of affection, he made no effort to include any of his favorite companions in his escape plans. The relationships that had seemed meaningful during normal times were revealed as purely transactional arrangements that he abandoned without hesitation when helping others might compromise his own survival. His betrayal was particularly cruel in the case of Livia Drusilla, a courtesan who had genuinely believed their relationship transcended commercial boundaries. Marcus had written her love letters, had promised to help secure her freedom, and had even discussed the possibility of a future together after she left the sex trade. But Livia's attempts to contact Marcus during the evacuation were ignored, and she learned about his departure only after his convoy had already left the city. The abandonment forced her to find alternative escape routes without the resources or connections that Marcus could have provided. Livia eventually joined a group of other abandoned workers who had been similarly betrayed by clients who had promised protection and assistance. Their shared experiences of deception and abandonment created bonds that proved more reliable than the relationships they had lost. The group's collective escape was more difficult and dangerous than individual evacuations would have been, but it also created genuine solidarity based on mutual dependence rather than economic exchange. The women looked out for each other, shared resources without expectation of repayment, and made decisions collectively rather than following the commands of male patrons or owners. Their success in reaching safety and rebuilding their lives demonstrated that authentic relationships based on equality and mutual respect could emerge even from the most exploitative circumstances. The disaster had stripped away the illusions and false promises that had concealed the true nature of their previous relationships, but it had also revealed their capacity for genuine friendship and cooperation. Livia's story was repeated throughout Pompeii as the crisis separated authentic relationships from convenient arrangements that had masqueraded as something deeper. The volcanic emergency created a test that revealed which connections were strong enough to survive when maintaining them required real sacrifice. The test was particularly severe for relationships that crossed the boundaries between free citizens and slaves, since Roman law provided no protection for slaves who might be abandoned by their owners during emergencies. The legal system assumed that owners would act in their slaves' best interests, but the volcanic crisis revealed how often this assumption was false. In the villa owned by Aulus Vettius Firmus, the evacuation exposed fundamental contradictions in relationships that had appeared stable and mutually beneficial during normal times. Aulus had accumulated significant wealth through investments in various entertainment businesses, and he maintained a household that included both traditional domestic slaves and several women who served as companions and hostesses for his business entertaining. The women occupied an unusual position in the household hierarchy, neither fully enslaved nor completely free, but bound to Aulus through complex arrangements that combined personal affection, economic dependence, and legal obligation. During normal times, this ambiguous status had provided them with more comfort and autonomy than most slaves enjoyed, while still ensuring their availability for Aulus's personal and business needs. But the volcanic emergency forced everyone to choose between competing loyalties and conflicting obligations. Aulus faced pressure from his family to evacuate quickly with only essential personnel, while the women in his household expected him to honor the promises of protection and care that had been part of their original arrangements. The crisis intensified when Aulus realized that including all of his dependents in the evacuation would require resources and create delays that might endanger his own survival. The women were not legally free to leave on their own, but helping them escape would consume transportation capacity and supplies that might be needed for family members and more valuable slaves. His initial response was to attempt a compromise that satisfied no one and endangered everyone. He offered to help some of the women evacuate while leaving others behind, creating resentment and fear among all members of the household. The partial assistance was insufficient to ensure anyone's survival, while being costly enough to compromise the evacuation's overall success. The women faced an equally difficult choice between accepting Aulus's inadequate protection and attempting independent escapes that would violate their legal obligations and might result in severe punishment if they survived the disaster. Their decision to remain loyal to their original arrangements rather than seeking alternative protection probably cost several of them their lives. Archaeological evidence suggests that most of Aulus's household died together in the villa's basement, apparently having decided to wait out the disaster rather than risking dangerous evacuation attempts. The decision was both tragic and understandable, since their intermediate legal status made it difficult to join other evacuation groups, while their dependence on Aulus made independent survival nearly impossible. Their deaths illustrated how the complex social relationships that characterize Pompeii's entertainment industry could become death traps when crisis demanded clear choices about priorities and loyalties. The ambiguous arrangements that had provided some protection during normal times became sources of confusion and paralysis when survival required decisive action. But other relationships proved more resilient when tested by ultimate crisis. Throughout the city, genuine bonds of affection and mutual respect enabled people to transcend legal and economic constraints that might otherwise have prevented cooperation during emergencies. The household of Lucius Caecilius Jucundus provides a remarkable example of how authentic relationships could overcome even the most restrictive social boundaries. Lucius was a banker and real estate investor who had accumulated substantial wealth, partly through investments in entertainment establishments, but he had also developed genuine personal connections with many people throughout the industry. Unlike other wealthy Romans who maintained strict boundaries between their business and personal relationships, Lucius had integrated several former sex workers into his household as trusted advisors and companions. Their knowledge of the entertainment industry proved valuable for his business investments, but their relationships had evolved beyond purely commercial arrangements into something resembling family connections. When the evacuation began, Lucius never considered abandoning any member of his extended household. Despite the additional costs and complications this created, he organized an evacuation that included not just his immediate family and legal dependents, but also the informal network of relationships he had built over years of business and personal interaction. The expanded evacuation group included over 30 people from various social backgrounds and legal statuses. Former slaves worked alongside free citizens, business associates traveled with personal friends, and people who had never met before the crisis cooperated because they shared connections to Lucius and trust in his leadership. The group's diversity proved to be an advantage rather than a liability during the dangerous journey to safety. Different individuals contributed specialized knowledge and skills that enabled the convoy to navigate obstacles and avoid dangers that might have stopped a more homogeneous group. Former sex workers provided information about unofficial routes and safe houses that enabled the group to avoid dangerous areas and official checkpoints that might have delayed their escape. Business associates contributed financial resources and connections with officials who could facilitate passage through controlled areas. Family members provided emotional support and maintained group morale during the most difficult parts of the journey. Most importantly, the genuine relationships that connected